and answers. Immediately to my left is Lynsey Addario. She's an American photojournalist who regularly works for the New York Times, the National Geographic, and Time magazine, and she's represented exclusively by Getty Images reportage. In 2000, Lynsey first traveled to Afghanistan under Taliban rule to document life and oppression under the Taliban, and has since covered conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Lebanon, Darfur, and the Congo. She photographs, features, and breaking news focused on humanitarian and human rights issues across the Middle East, South Asia, and Africa. And in 2015, American Photo Magazine named Lynsey as one of 5 most influential photographers of the past 25 years, saying that she changed the way that we saw the world's conflicts. Lynsey's recent bodies of work include an ongoing reportage on Syrian refugees around the region for the New York Times, ISIS's push into Iraq, the civil war in South Sudan, and African and Middle Eastern migrants arriving on Sicily's shores for the New York Times. Lynsey has been the recipient of numerous awards, including the MacArthur Fellowship or Genius Grant 2009, Overseas Press Club's Oliver Brevet Award for Best Photographic Reporting from Abroad in Magazines and Books for her series Veiled Rebellion, Afghan Women. She was part of the New York Times team to win the 2009 Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting for her photographs in Talibanistan, September 7, 2008. She recently released the New York Times best-selling memoir, It's What I Do. She's on the Leadership Under Fire recommended reading list, and it's a fantastic read, which chronicles her personal and professional life as a photojournalist coming of age in the post-9/11 world. That's her first book. We're very, very happy to have Lynsey Addario with us. So, Lynsey, I'd like to start with you this evening, please. And first question I'd like to ask you is this. I'd like to address your qualifications for being here today on the panel to talk to firefighters about risk and resiliency. And you've observed a lot of warfighting. And when embedded, you relied upon troops for your security. How many embeds have you done in lethal combat environments?
I probably can't count. I've been embedding with the military since 2003 in Iraq and Afghanistan. So probably a dozen embeds throughout the last 12 years.
And can you describe briefly for us, or not necessarily briefly, if you like, give us some details about how dangerous those environments were that you operated in?
Sure. I think every embed is very different. It depends on the troops I'm with. It depends on the access they give us. It depends on how much they trust us. When I say us, it's me and usually a writer that's embedded at the time. It depends on the terrain. For example, probably the toughest embed I did was in the Korangal Valley in Afghanistan. That was in 2007, probably one of the most dangerous places in Afghanistan at the time. And it was the place where the United States military was dropping the most bombs. And so as journalists, we wanted to go there because we wanted to see what was happening there to inspire this. And so we wanted to see for ourselves. And the only way to get a sense of the rhythm of war is to be there. And so I was with a female colleague, and we went to the press affairs office and we said, we'd like to go to the Korangal Valley. And he sort of just looked at us and laughed and said, it's not a place that's fit for women. And we said, well, why not? And he said, well, there's no place for you to sleep and there's no place for you to go to the bathroom. And we said, well, where do the men sleep and where do the men go to the bathroom? And they said they sleep in bunkers on the side of the mountain. And we said, well, we can do that. And so he said, okay, come back tomorrow. So we went back tomorrow, and he sort of couldn't say no because we were journalists, so we don't abide by the same rules that the military does. And so they did fly us out, and we ended up spending 2 months living on the side of the mountain with the 173rd Airborne. And it was incredibly kinetic. We were mortared and shot at all the time. Went on 6-7 hour a day patrols at 7,000 feet through the mountains. It was, at the end, everything was gearing up for this battalion-wide operation called Operation Rock Avalanche, where we were airlifted onto the side of a mountain in this area that the U.S. military hadn't been in years because it was full of Taliban. And we had to jump out of Blackhawks in the middle of the night onto the side of the mountain. Very quickly, the Taliban was making their way towards us. We spent 3 days walking through the mountains, sleeping there on the side of the mountain. And then were airlifted to another part, eventually got ambushed from 3 sides by the Taliban. 1 soldier was killed, 2 others were shot. That was something that was very intense, primarily because of the length of time and the fact that we were always on edge because we were being shot at and mortared all the time and eventually were ambushed.
Thank you. I think we could agree then that you uniquely qualified to talk to firefighters about risk and resiliency. I would also like to note, Lynsey, that right behind you, playing behind you, is a slideshow of some of your photographs. I'd just like to draw everyone's attention to those. Also, a great many of her photographers can be seen at her website, LynseyAddario.com, and of course are published in her book, It's What I Do. Lynsey, there's much debate in the modern American fire service revolving around what we will and what we will not do to risk our lives. What's worth risking our life for? In fact, one of the key motivations for this conference and this panel that we're having this evening is to examine and challenge a fire service paradigm that is increasingly less prone to accepting risk. The question that we all have for you, I'm sure, is why do you risk your life to take photographs?
It's not really about taking photographs for me. It's really about bearing witness to history and to things that are happening and that affect America and Americans. And I think it's very important to provide you all and everyone in the U.S. with a document of what's happening. So, for example, after September 11th, when we went and attacked Afghanistan, rightly so, because we had been attacked, I wanted to be there. I wanted to see what was happening on the ground, why we were there. I was familiar with Afghanistan because I had been working there under the Taliban, so I wanted to go back. Once you start acquiring those tools to cover war, it's easier to go back because I'm familiar with the rhythms of war. I'm familiar with certain cultures, how to navigate those cultures. In 2003, when we were going to war in Iraq, again, I wanted to be there. I wanted to see, we all knew we were going to war at some point. It was very clear. For me, I felt it was very important to bear witness to that. We were sending troops into combat. If I can get access to that, I find that a great privilege. And so I think it's very important. It's important for people to see in the newspaper what's happening, for our policymakers to have people on the ground, because they can't go to these places. So they rely very heavily on people like journalists like me. And so it's not necessarily why would I risk my life for a photo. It's, for me, it is my life, and it is sort of, it has become everything I do. And I think that if I didn't do it, I would be irresponsible at this point.
On the fire ground, Lynsey, the harshest conditions, the greatest danger, and the place where things can go wrong very, very quickly is often on the floor directly above the fire. Firefighters often talk about getting jammed up or having a floor above moment. You've certainly had some of these as well. And the one I'd like to talk to you about occurred in during Libya's Arab Spring Revolution. So I have a 2-part question. When you're alone with no security infrastructure like you were in Libya, what is it like to constantly be asking yourself if you should stay or if you should go, if you're safe or if you're not? And further, after you consider that, Lynsey, can you talk to us about what your decision-making process is? What is the intuitive framework that's running in the background for you?
So I think one thing that a lot of people don't understand is that journalists don't travel with guns. We don't carry weapons in our car. We don't. One of the sort of, ironically, the way we find security is by saying, we're journalists, we're unarmed, so please don't kill us. Basically, that's what we say when we're taken hostage or if we run into a checkpoint. So all of our tools to stay alive have to do with our instinct and have to do with our relationships with people. And we rely very heavily on translators and drivers who know the terrain, who know the people, and who can sort of read when things don't look like they're going the right way. In Libya, during the uprising in 2011, the only way to cover the uprising was to sneak into the country illegally without visas, because Gaddafi did not want journalists there. He did not want people to see that there was a popular uprising against him. So we knew that one of the very big risks for us was getting caught by Gaddafi's troops. That was something that was very clear. Gaddafi kept saying over and over, if you see journalists, you should kill them because they're spies. So we all entered through Egypt, and we were working in eastern Libya. And as the battle started, and as the front line started pushing forward, a handful of photographers pushed forward with the rebels. And very quickly we understood that the combat would be some of the most dangerous combat we'd ever seen, because the terrain was very flat. There was no place to hide. And Gaddafi's troops completely outweaponed us and the rebels. And the rebels we were with had no training. They weren't actually fighters. They were doctors, engineers, teachers, people who had decided to sort of stand up and fight Gaddafi. So they had no experience. And we were basically stuck with this militia that had no experience. And so one of the first days we were on the front line, I remember we were pushing forward and there was tank fire coming in and there's nowhere to hide. You're sort of just sitting there. None of us had body armor because none of us anticipated there being fighting. We thought it would be like Egypt. And so none of us had helmets or vests. And then suddenly a helicopter gunship came in and came literally right above us and was spraying the ground with 50 caliber bullets all around us. And we're just sort of standing there hoping we don't get hit. I mean, I just sort of crouched down next to a car that was not armored. These are all things that are, obviously they're happening very quickly, and you don't learn. Libya was a new combat for me. So you're still learning sort of how to navigate that. When we stayed about 2 weeks on the front line, and finally I was getting tired and I wanted to go rest back east in Benghazi. And I had ironically called my editor and said I need to go rest. And we were in the city of Addario, and we knew the town was about to fall because all of the signs were there. Civilians were fleeing. Our translator was getting calls saying Gaddafi's troops are coming closer. So we knew the city was going to fall. And so as journalists, you have to make a decision. How long do you stay? And obviously we want to stay as long as we possibly can because we want to get the best story and the most accurate story. But you also have to get out before you get killed. So we were in 2 separate cars. That's also a tactic that we use to help minimize risk, because if one car breaks down, then you have a backup car. Also, when you have 4 people in one car, for example, you have very different interpretations or very different ideas of how long it's safe to stay. If you only have 2 people in the car, then you can sort of discuss that. But when you have 4, it's a lot harder. So basically, we were in 2 separate cars. Me and Tyler were in one car. Anthony and Steve were in another car. Anthony and Steve's driver was shot. His brother was shot at the front line. So he stopped the car in the middle of the road and dumped all of their stuff on the sidewalk. So we all ended up in one vehicle. And at that point, our driver started getting nervous. And at that point, we should have listened to our driver. Because in my experience covering war, you should always listen to the local. You should listen to the driver or translator. Several people in the car did not want to leave yet, so we went back to the hospital to look at civilian casualties. And at that point, we saw many civilians fleeing the town. And we knew that at that point, it was time to go. Again, 2 people in the car wanted to go forward, wanted to go back to the front line. So we're all in the same car. You can't, for me, I sort of kept my mouth shut because I was the only woman, and I felt like I didn't want to be the girl who was scared, so I sort of didn't say anything, but I knew it was time to go. We went back to the front line, and at that point, there were snipers in the city. And when there are snipers in the city, they're obviously in the city because they're close enough. So at that point, our driver completely panicked, and he was screaming, saying, we have to go, we have to go. He was getting phone calls saying Gaddafi's troops are in the city. By the time we left, we ran the only road out of town. We saw Gaddafi's troops on the horizon, and I was the first to see them, and I said, those are Gaddafi's troops, and my colleagues sort of laughed and said, you're crazy. And I said, they have uniforms. They were the first people we saw with perfect uniforms. And so we had to make a decision. Do we stop the car and announce ourselves as journalists and hope that they don't kill us, or do we just try and blow past the checkpoint? Well, everyone was screaming something different, obviously. Everyone was saying, drive, don't stop. The driver stopped the car. He panicked. He jumped out of the car and he threw his hands up and said, we're journalists. We never saw him again. I was sitting behind the driver on the left-hand side. That's the way the car was. And Anthony and Tyler and Steve were to my right. They all crawled out the right side. In that moment that the car was stopped, the rebels that we had been with started opening fire on that checkpoint. So we were caught completely in the middle of crossfire. There were bullets everywhere. I put my head in my lap and was sort of waiting to see which way to get out of the car. And once I saw that the bullets were everywhere, I knew I had to get out of the car because our car wasn't armored. So I crawled out. I did not get out the same side my driver got out. I crawled across the back seat and got out the same side my colleagues got out and tried to make a run for it. There was one building where I knew I could get cover. But very quickly, one of Gaddafi's troops grabbed me and he was holding me in the middle of the gun battle. And I didn't want to surrender my cameras, very stupidly, but it's instinct. So, of course, he's grabbing at my cameras, and I'm grabbing at them back in the middle of this gun battle. So finally, I gave him my camera, and I made a run for this building. And when we got to the other side of the building, we were told to lie face down in the dirt, and they were about to execute us. Each one of us had a gun to our heads. They decided, at that point, the commander came over and said, you can't kill them, they're American. This is all in Arabic, but Anthony spoke Arabic and he translated for us. So at that point, they tied us up. Each one of us was tied up, our arms behind our backs and our ankles tied together. With me, they took my shoes off and tied my feet together with my shoelaces. And then they placed us in vehicles back on the front line and kept us there for hours as sort of the battle raged around us and we were tied up. Intermittently, they would come over and punch us in the face. For me, from the beginning, I was groped repeatedly. And then we were put in vehicles and transferred to another location. Again, beaten, punched. The men were beaten on the backs, smashed on the backs of the heads with Kalashnikovs. Eventually, we were thrown in the back of a pickup truck and driven 400 miles to Sirte. Under the hot sun. And every 45 minutes or so, we were attacked by a mob and beaten and we weren't pulled out of the car. Every time it got to that point, the driver would speed up and go. Then we were put in prison for a night. We were then taken out of prison and put in military aircraft and tied to the plane, the inside of the webbing of the plane. We were tied and flown to Tripoli. And when we got to Tripoli, there was a fight for who would get us between the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The Ministry of Interior is notorious for torture. So we did not obviously want to end up with the Ministry of Interior. We knew Anthony was translating, but we knew there was a fight for who would get us because we were put, even though we were blindfolded, we could tell we were put in a paddy wagon. And then they took us out and they put us in like an SUV. Eventually we ended up with the foreign ministry, which was great because at that point they said, okay, you're now with the government of Libya and we won't beat you anymore. And they didn't, in fact, but they kept us for 3 more days under house arrest. They said, it was sort of an apartment with bars on the windows and said, if you look out the window, we'll kill you. So we sort of just sat in this apartment and had no idea how long we would stay there. So that was Libya. Then we were released.
So it's obviously in an environment like that very exhausting to always be having a go, no-go decision-making process running in the back of your mind, particularly when you have no security at all, no way to defend or protect yourself, and no recourse under the law when you get captured or taken hostage. describe this to an extent in your book, and I'd just like to, whether it happens to be in Libya or whether it's in the Sudan or Afghanistan, even on your first trip, to explain to us a little bit about what your decision-making process is when it comes to go, no go, how do you preserve yourself. If you could just tell us a little bit about that, that would be nice, and maybe even a little bit about how you believe your instincts have developed since your first time in Afghanistan pre-9/11.
I mean, I think a lot of my decision process on how long to stay and whether to go, I have to do a lot of research. I mean, a lot of what I'm doing before I go on assignment is making phone calls to not only other journalists who have been there recently, other photographers, but also local translators, local journalists, local fixers who can tell us what the situation is, what the risks are. Last month I went into Syria, and I had said I will not go into Syria because I've been kidnapped now twice. And I said, okay, if I get kidnapped for a third time, forget it. Like, I can't put my family through that. So I said I wouldn't go to Syria, but I was asked to go into Syria. And so I spent a week making phone calls and figuring out whether I could do it in a way that I could come back alive. And I felt like after talking to a lot of people, I could do that, that there was a way to do it safely. So I think a lot of sort of my decision process is something that is continuous. You know, I could say, okay, I will go in, but if at any point I feel like, you know, our location is known or people are watching us, then I could leave. You know, I mean, I think the other thing is for me, there's always an out. It's not, you know, I hope there is, but that's always one of the things that I don't have to be sort of stubborn and say, okay, if I've made the decision to go, I'm not going to leave. Well, I always leave that door open at this point. I think when I was younger, I didn't recognize the signs so much as to, you know, to make those calculations. Now I understand a lot more about how to read signs, you know, and I think a lot of that, again, comes with trusting people around you. And having a good writer, you know, being in a good team, for example. I always work with a writer, and a lot of, for me, a lot of sort of the decision-making process comes in teamwork.
Thank you. Lynsey, after being released by your captors in Libya, many people thought that your work would change fundamentally. How would you address that contention? How did that play out?
It didn't change very much. It changed a little bit, but I think also wars have changed. I mean, we don't have troops on the ground the way we did before. So when I was spending a lot of time doing military embeds, it's because we had troops like Jason, like people that I would go do embeds with and go on patrols with. That doesn't exist anymore right now. Last week I was in Afghanistan, and you know, there are no troops to embed with. If I want to do military embeds, I have to go with the Afghan National Army. I'm not willing to do that, you know. So I think I'm not covering war just to cover war. I was covering war to sort of get a sense of what our troops were doing on the ground. I'm still covering war zones all the time. I'm not doing so much combat. So I guess that's where I'm at now.
Lynsey, you've been around a lot of battlefield commanders, a lot of soldiers and Marines. What characteristics and traits have you observed in those, particularly in the commanders, that define combat effectiveness and the ability to accomplish the mission?
So I think one of the really important things that I think it's very important for the troops to understand the area in which they're operating. And that was something that, when I was saying earlier, when I first went into Iraq in 2003, it was very difficult for me because I saw very quickly that a lot of the troops who were in Iraq had no idea about the culture in which they were operating. And that was not their fault. I mean, these guys were sent into Iraq. They had no idea they would suddenly have to run a country. You know, I mean, they were responsible for basically providing security in Baghdad and around the country. but they were never versed on sort of the Arab world and how to conduct yourself. So there were a lot of cultural mishaps. There were a lot of cultural misunderstandings that led eventually to a lot of animosity. Again, I don't think at all that was the troops' fault. I think that was our administration's fault for not teaching the troops before they went into battle how to operate. So for many years, that was frustrating for everyone. When I embedded with Jason in 2009, one of the first things I realized was how amazing he was with the Afghans, and they loved him. I mean, he can walk around this area of Nowzad that was one of the most hostile places. He can walk around without body armor. I mean, that was astonishing, and that was only because he was very smart about how he operated. People trusted him, and he let them know that he trusted them. And that created this environment that was unprecedented in that area. And I think that's an incredible testament to understanding how to operate, understanding where you are and what the risks are.
Thank you very much, Lynsey. You've done a great job answering our questions, and I'd just like to tell everyone that Lynsey lives abroad now, and she's been very, very busy of late, traveling the world, doing good work, and doing work in support of her books, and as a consequence, she's been very busy just on these last few days here in the United States, and Lynsey may have to leave us before the panel concludes. And so what I'd like to do is give everybody the opportunity here now, if they would like to ask Lynsey a question from the audience, we'd be happy to hear that. Yes, sir.
We talked earlier about the mission and doctrine. In your case, taking photographs, telling a story. Mm-hmm. How have you seen what news impact foreign policy? Or maybe the light bulb moment said, wow, they changed foreign policy doctrine based on what we were before.
I mean, I think that's been sort of, I believe in photojournalism. I believe in journalism. So for me, I'm sort of still idealist. I still think that a powerful photograph can change the world. The first image that comes to mind right now is the picture of that young baby who washed up on shore in Turkey during this whole migration crisis. And that basically motivated European policymakers to act immediately over something that they had not responded to or even addressed for months. So I think that was the power of an image. I think with my personal work, I've been very fortunate to work for the New York Times. That's an incredible newspaper that is read by the President of the United States and a lot of his policymakers. And so I think it's not my work, for example, but it's collectively the journalists that work for these publications that over and over, the wars in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, when things are going wrong, I do think it's very important to be there and to put that out there. So there's not one light bulb moment, but I think you see over time when images and when good journalism does inspire people to act.
Is there another question for Lynsey? Okay, so sure. The question for everyone that didn't hear is, obviously Lynsey's been in some very dicey situations, and the question is related to mental toughness, and if there's any particular techniques or experience Lynsey has in helping her to develop or use mental toughness.
So there are courses that journalists can take before they go to war, and it teaches them how to respond when you're kidnapped, how to manage in a gun battle. But for many years, I was too poor to afford those classes. And by the time I actually started making enough money to go to them, I had been kidnapped already. So I figured, well, I'm just not going to take those classes. But I think a lot of it is, again, it's instinct. And for example, I'm not the kind of person, like in Libya when we were taken, I think we were very lucky because no one freaked out. Everyone was very composed and very calm. And we were very lucky that we were together and we were actually held together the whole time. And I think that people underestimate how strong the mind is, and the survival instinct really kicks in. So it doesn't matter, for me, it's really about getting through each moment second by second. It's not about, I don't look at the bigger picture. I just say like, okay, I have to stay alive. So what do I have to do to get through this moment? So, I'm punched in the face. That sucks, but can I get through it? Yeah, I can. I think that it's important to just stay focused and to just stay calm, because when you start screaming and shouting, particularly in a place like the Middle East where people do not like loud women and women who are making a scene, I think it's important also, again, to understand how to respond based on who you're with, people in that part of the world, a woman who is vulnerable, a woman who is crying, a woman who is weak, will elicit a much better response than a woman who tries to be really tough. They don't like strong women like that. So it's important to understand that and to act vulnerable rather than tough, So I think that for me, it's just about sort of getting through the moment and staying alive.
Yes.
Lynsey, I have a question about something that you brought up earlier, shouting a woman in those environments where they're predominantly men at combat, in a common combat line. Can you speak to me about any of your experience or notice of any changes with your female presence on a combat line men?
Yeah, I think when I show up, people are always like, oh, shit, the chick's here. Like, oh, no, is she going to be able to keep up? Is she going to slow us down? Is she going to, I think people automatically, that's sort of the when they see me, they just think, and I'm 5 feet tall, so there are like limits to what I can do, but I think that you just have to prove yourself. And it's like with anything else, you have to sort of prove that you can keep up, you can carry your own weight. You can't, in Operation Rock Avalanche, we had to carry our kit for 7 days walking through the mountains. We had to carry water, food, my cameras, sleeping bag, all the gear on our backs. And I couldn't ask someone to help me. So I think a lot of it is about just being able to prove yourself. And there is a lot of skepticism. There used to be when I first arrived. Most people would just look at me, and I can see it. They don't have to say anything, but I could see it immediately, So it's really just about, keeping your mouth shut and just doing it.
Another question for Lynsey? Yes.
Lynsey, you've obviously gone into a lot of places that the changes before and after, potential consequences. Early on in your career, maybe not full understanding of those consequences. Do you have any previous notions on how you do that?
I didn't actually have preconceived notions. I didn't, I think my approach to people is to be extraordinarily friendly. So even in these horrible situations, I try and smile and be really nice and very innocent. And I think that often works, even in horribly hostile situations. I think no one ever knows how they're going to react in these situations. So even if you have an idea, first of all, I didn't anticipate getting kidnapped in Fallujah, and so that was in 2004. When that happened, I didn't anticipate it happening. And when it happened, you sort of don't have time to think. You're already in the middle of it. So I think it's also just about sort of, again, I guess I was surprised by the fact that I didn't sort of lose it more than I did. That I was able to stay calm. And I sort of do attribute that to just the mind being very strong, and you do have a survival instinct.
Speaking to leadership, not being a member of the military, not being a firefighter, what were some of the more positive leadership traits that you saw in the battleground changes and you committed to what stood out?
I mean, it was incredible to me to see these, 20, 25, 26-year-old captains making decisions that would affect the lives of all of his troops, in spur of the moment. I mean, Dan Kearney, who we were embedded with in the Korengal, it was extraordinary watching him having to decide, do I call in an airstrike? How do I handle this? Do I go into this village we've just bombed by making a mistake? All of these decisions have to do with leadership, and they have to do with people who are making decisions that will affect people's lives at a very young age, and so that to me was incredibly impressive. People having to learn about the history of a place like Afghanistan that, who knew 15 years ago that would even enter into any of our lives, and so I think people have had to sort of school themselves very quickly on places that we didn't realize would have any relevance to us. And that was incredible. I'm always impressed with the guys I'm with, and it's, I think it's extraordinary the work that the troops were doing.
Well, Lynsey, we're thankful that you could have time to stop by and talk to us this evening. Many of us have had great anticipation just wanting to meet you. I know Jason has told me on several occasions that you're not one of the most resilient women he's ever met. You're one of the most resilient people he's ever met.
Thank you.
And so what an honor for us to have you on a panel to talk about risk and resiliency. We understand that you may have to move on to other commitments, and you're certainly welcome to stay with us as long as you would like to. But we understand that if you need to leave early, that's certainly fine.
Thank you.
And with that being said, please, ladies and gentlemen, Lynsey Addario. I would also say, if you have not yet had the opportunity to pick up Lynsey's book, it's what I do. It's a fantastic read.